Ladies and gentlemen, this Red Gaming Tech.com video, we're going to be further discussing the technical abilities of the Xbox One. Now, the Xbox One has had several mysteries that have been synonymous with it, including the exact working of the bandwidth, the workings of the ESRAM, and much more besides. Now, Albert Penello has been recently making a series of both tweets and internet posts on various different forums, and we'll go into those in just a moment, that have sparked further controversy. And you could almost say it's getting to the point where those discussions are becoming fairly vigorous. Let's go with that, because people aren't exactly sure where he's coming from. Now, I wasn't going to cover this morning because it's a massive topic, but so many people, when I woke up today, were quite literally bombarding me with questions regarding this, so I at least wanted to get something up this morning. I do have work fairly shortly, so it's going to have to be a fairly brief video, but I do want to get everyone onto the same page. Later on today, I will be doing some further analysis on this, and also I have a few PlayStation 4 specific things as well lined up today / tomorrow, but we'll just have to see how it goes on time. Anyway, enough padding, let's jump into the actual meat, shall we? So I'm going to be reading you guys out a series of quotes in just a moment, but let's give you some context. As I said, this is quite a lengthy discussion, but basically most of this comes from a couple of recent comments, both from Albert himself as well as developers. I'm going to really briefly get you guys up to speed on this, because I say that because there's already a couple of videos discussing this in depth on this channel. The first is that Albert himself has said that the 50% difference between the Xbox One and PlayStation 4 are greatly overstated. He said that the difference is far less than that because of the optimizations that Microsoft have made to the Xbox One, the APIs, and much more besides. Then, literally a day or two later, a developer or two stepped in. Actually several developers. I've got a video of that currently, and they've actually said it is 50%. Albert then has stepped in because a huge crap storm started to brew over the internet. As the sky started to blacken, Albert took his umbrella out and decided to go for a stroll and started to answer people's questions. Then he debunked the fact that the Xbox One actually had the Volcanic Islands GPU in. Now, the Volcanic Islands is AMD's next generation graphics card. To put it clearly, the current GPU inside the Xbox One and PlayStation 4 is of the Radeon 7000, and then the 8000 is basically a very small difference between the 8 and the 7000. But they are working on what is known as the Volcanic Islands. Now, the Volcanic Islands is, from what we hear about leaks and how accurate leaks are, of course, who the hell knows, but apparently there is a huge difference between the Volcanic Islands and the current 7000 series, and the rumour was that, well, basically the Radeon 9000, the Volcanic Islands, there was a discrete GPU buried inside the Xbox One. No one really believed it. I mean, maybe a couple of people did. I thought it had about 95% chance of actually being untrue. And of course, it was untrue. The reason that you can never give it 100% is because, let's face it, you don't have access to Microsoft or Sony's exact specifications. So anyway, all of this has prompted a crap storm on the internet, and several people were saying, well, how was Albert coming to the various conclusions that he was? He's just full of PR. And honestly speaking, from the perspective of someone who doesn't really post on internet forums, I read a hell of a lot of them, but I don't really post into them anymore. I think Albert actually did a fairly reasonable job answering the questions. Now, I'm going to add a caveat into that. The reason I say that isn't because I'm not basing this on technical accuracy just for a moment, but I believe that he actually was quite polite and courteous, considering people were sometimes reaming him on some of these forums quite badly, and I can understand where some people were coming from, because some of the stuff he was saying wasn't exactly making sense, which is fine. But at the same time, I do believe that there has to be like a level of civility in the questions, because otherwise it becomes increasingly difficult for someone who's trying to answer questions to do so in a very hostile environment. That's my personal opinion. I'm not defending Albert, I'm not attacking any of the communities, I'm just saying my personal opinion that whenever I notice that a discussion goes that way, nothing really gets resolved, because usually the threads or whatever, the discussion gets closed and that's it. But I understand it was some frustration for both sides. I'm not saying that Albert wasn't causing the frustration or whatever. I'm just saying that I think sometimes people need to just, take a step back and then post questions more calmly, and I think it does get things resolved a lot easier. That's just my personal opinions, of course. So anyway, I'm going to jump into the actual questions now, and I'm actually going to read out some of the posts from Albert. As I said, these are fairly lengthy, but getting into it. This is verbatim, by the way. I see my statements the other day caused more of a stir than intended. I saw threads locking down so fast as they popped up, so I apologise for the delayed response. I was hoping my comments would lead to the discussion to be more about the games, and the fact the games on both systems look great. As a sign of my points about performance, but unfortunately I saw the discussion of my credibility, and this is, by the way, slightly off topic, this is part of what I was saying earlier. A lot of people were discrediting Albert. So I thought I would add more detail about what I said the other day, that perhaps people could debate those individual merits, but instead of making personal attacks, this should hopefully dismiss the notion I'm simply creating FUD or spin. I do want to be super clear, I'm not disparaging Sony, I'm not trying to diminish them, or their launch, or what they've said, but I do need to draw comparisons, since I'm trying to explain the way people are calculating differences between the two machines isn't completely accurate. I think I've been upfront and have nothing but respect for those guys, and I'm not a fan of misinformation about our product or performance. And now he goes on to the points. So here's a couple of points about the individual parts for people to consider. You can check the screen, by the way, and they would have popped up as bullet points, so you can check those out yourself, but I will read them out just in case you're, not able to do so. 18 CUs versus 12 CUs, about 50% performance. Multi-core processors have inherent efficiencies with more CUs, so it's incorrect to say 50% more GPU. Adding to that, each of our CUs is running 6% faster. It's not simply a 6% clock speed increase overall. We have more memory bandwidth, 176GB peak on paper for GDDR5. Obviously, Albert is referring to the PlayStation 4. And on peak, paper is 276GB per second. That is 68GB per second on DDR3, 204GB per second on ESRAM. ESRAM can do read-write cycles simultaneously, so I see this number misquoted. We have at least 10% more CPU, not only a faster processor, but a better audio chip, also offloading CPU cycles. We understand that GPU and its importance very well. Microsoft invented direct compute, and we have been using GPU in a shipping product since 2010. It's called Connect. Speaking of GPU, we have 3 times the coherent memory bandwidth of the GPU at 30GB per second, which significantly improves our ability for the CPU to efficiently read data generated by the GPU. Then he ends by saying, I hopefully some of these more specific points will understand where we have reduced the bottlenecks in our system. I'm sure this will get debated endlessly, but at least I'm seeing I'm backing up my points. I still believe that we get little credit for the fact that as a SW software company, the people designing the system are some of the smartest graphics engineers around. They understand how to architect and balance the system for graphics performance. Each company has their strengths, and I feel that our strength is overlooked when evaluating both boxes. Giving this confirmation belief as a significant gap, we are working in the most senior graphics and silicon engineers to get the more depth on this topic. They were more credible than I am, and they could talk about detail about some of the benchmarks we've done and how we've balanced our system. Thanks again for letting me participate. Hopefully this gives people more background to my claims. End quote. Okay, so in like a movie, or like if you've ever watched Dragon Ball Z, and the heroes are just watching, a fight and they're losing, or they're doing all right, but then that one person, that one act happens, and then suddenly everyone rallies, and it's like, I'm not taking this anymore. That's pretty much what happened here. You see, there were several points of contention that were created on those points. Now, Albert is saying that he passed the points over to some of their chief technical guys, in fact one of the brightest technical guys who apparently worked in designing the system and also goes to speak to various developers, and he was the one who basically okayed and gave the points to Albert. So in other words, Albert is saying he didn't just create this himself. He didn't just, he wasn't just chilling in his office and write down a bunch of points. He ran them through one of the technical designers. But anyone who is reading or, heard that, you'll know that there are several issues with it, right? And we're going to go into a couple of them in this particular video, and we're going to be actually doing a lot more analysis of it later. As I said, I'm running out of time. He says checking the time, unfortunately, but I did want to get something out on this because I want to hear you guys. I genuinely want to know what you guys think of this as well. So do comment. I might not message you back instantly because I will be really busy tonight, but please do message me because I'm very curious what you think. So, okay, I'm going to tackle the easier ones first. I'm going to read it out just partially. We have at least 10% more CPU, not only a faster processor, but a better audio chip. Okay, so people immediately picked up on this one, and I think it's a fairly obvious one. Now, this stems from the fact that the Xbox One's CPU, runs at 1.75 gigahertz. Now remember, initially both systems were reported to be running at 1.6. So if you add about 10%, it's actually a smidgen under, but let's not split hairs over, a micro percent. You'll notice that, of course, that leads up to the 1.75, so Microsoft did indeed increase the clock speed. Now, there are a couple of arguments to this. Firstly, regarding the CPU side of things. Now, the argument is, how do you know what Sony's clock speed is? It's a very difficult point because Sony, there were rumors, and the problem with rumors, as we all know, I can create a rumor right now that, the Xbox One, once you play it, you immediately feel 50 times more happy immediately because the controllers secrete a neurotoxin. It's like anyone could create a rumor, but it doesn't mean the rumor is true. But the rumor is that Sony were looking into increasing the clock speed of the of the PlayStation 4 by a similar number to Microsoft. It hasn't been confirmed. So by saying that we do have at least a 10% faster CPU, how do you know it's at least 10%, right? Because 1.6 to 1.75 is about 10%. It's not 11 or 12%. So either Sony's CPU is like, let's say 1.55 gigahertz, right? I'm not saying it is, I'm just saying, let's go with this room and figure it out verbatim wise. So let's assume it is 1.55 gigahertz. That would mean that yes, it's at least 10% more powerful. But okay, it doesn't seem to be because Sony's does seem to be 1.6. The silence at Sony's camp is deafening. I actually read this on a couple of internet posts, and it's really true because they were really, really quick to point out the 1.84 GFLOPS of computing power. That does mean that we do know the clock speed of the Xbox One's and the PlayStation 4's GPU because we know how the GPUs in both systems work. It's not too difficult to calculate it. Providing you know the maths. So we do know that the PlayStation 4's clock speed is 800 megahertz when it comes to the GPU, because we know the GCN architecture, we know the performance, and therefore we can reverse engineer it based on everything else we know and say, okay, we know the part is 800 megahertz. It's not easy to do that with the clock speed because we have no performance delta. They have not told us the performance of the CPU. They haven't given us any indication. And, the closest we know about the CPU, which absolutely means nothing, of course, is the fact that the maximum speed for it is 2 gigahertz, and that's about it. But 2 gigahertz is the maximum speed. Obviously, neither company is going for that because, well, heat. So, you tell me what the clock speed is, because I don't know. I can tell you that it's a guess. It's most likely between 1.6 and 1.75, but that doesn't mean anything. And for Microsoft to say this, there's one of two options. One, they're just guessing that and going with the fact that they believe it is 1.6 gigahertz based on rumors, or the alternative is that they do have someone working inside Sony who, for example, has sold them industrial secrets, industrial espionage, basically, whatever you want to call it, or maybe a leak at AMD, maybe, whatever you want to say, and they indeed know the clock speed of the PlayStation 4. So you can look at it either way. So you can look at it that they're basically guessing, hoping that Sony haven't increased the clock speed, or there is a leak somewhere. Microsoft know Sony's clock speed. They can't admit it because obviously that is admitting industrial espionage, and therefore, well, yeah, they know that Sony are running at 1.6. I don't know which one it is, because I am not Microsoft, I am not Sony, and you will just have to guess. But saying at least 10% if the PlayStation 4's clock speed is 1.6, it doesn't exactly make much sense, because, yeah, at least means that, at the bare minimum. So, yeah, well, whatever. The next one is the better audio chip for offloading CPU cycles. Now, this is a pretty big one in and of itself. So let's actually give this a bit of merit just for a moment. Before we really discuss and start taking this apart, let's actually give it a little bit of a legs to stand on, because to be fair to Microsoft, they do have a certain amount of point. You may remember I did an audio block analysis of the Xbox One the other day, and as I said in that video, to be fair to Microsoft, one of the really big points of the Xbox 360, and indeed that generation, was audio. Audio was, let's just say what it was costly, right? So audio, by the way, is everything. That's you and your buddies want to speak to you and your buddies are speaking to one another on Xbox Live. That is, you and your buddies are hearing large ass explosions in Battlefield, the music playing, whatever. All of that, especially when you start talking about positional audio, because remember, positional audio is really complicated. I'm not going to go too much into it in this video, because it's a massive subject, and I'd spend like 15 minutes discussing positional audio, but obviously it basically, really simplifying it, it's pretty much telling you, well, Johnny is exactly in that position, he's shooting a gun, therefore make the gun sound like it is coming from that position, which of course is really important if you have a really good surround sound setup. Obviously, for those of us who are listening with, say, stereo headphones and or stereo TV output, doesn't mean much, but for those of us who are, say, got 5.1 or 7.1 headphones / speaker outputs, whatever, then obviously that means a hell of a lot, and games now are starting to increasingly become inclined towards that, because it does add to the cinematic experience. And so, with the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3, the basic premise, I know specifically the Xbox 360, I'm not so sure about PS3 actually, I'll take that back. But with the Xbox 360, the audio hardware wasn't sucky or anything like that, but developers did say that, one hardware thread was dedicated in certain games purely to audio. And I don't care what way you slice that cake, I don't care how many, raisins you add on the cake, the fact is that's a very expensive cake. In other words, the audio in that respect is quite expensive. So Microsoft did their best to reduce this. Now, I'm not going to go too much into the audio block, because it is, once again, like a 20-minute subject on it by itself, so you can check out the video if you're really curious. But it's a simple case of, the audio block is there to do multiple things. One of them, for example, is to connect, right? It actually has a dedicated little unit on it, for example, to help clear up audio for Connect for the purposes of basically understanding what the hell you're saying to it, and to reduce the overhead on the CPU. It's also got, for example, encoders and so on, which help to send data, minimize the data, in other words, reduce it. You can think of it compressing, yeah? So almost like you'd use like WinZip to compress a file, whatever that file is, and send it to your buddy via email because you've got a couple of slide presentations you want to send them, and the best option of course would be to zip it first to make that email as small as possible so it sends as quick as possible. So that's one example. So all those little bits and pieces, but as many people have said, there's a problem with all of this. You can tell me that your audio block is better than worse than Sony, but Sony have been very cagey on what they've done with the audio block. And this is the problem, because both companies have actually released a lot of information about certain parts of their machines, but not all of the information about all of their machines. So let's assume Microsoft are really, really, really upfront with the clock speed of their system. Great, they have been, but Sony haven't. Sony also haven't been that upfront in regards to the audio blocks. To be fair, there are questions even regarding the Xbox Ones, but hey, we know more about it. So to say that we have a better, audio chip isn't really fair because we don't know what the audio chip is exactly on the PlayStation 4, at least according to my knowledge. I mean, I have done a bit of Googling. Maybe I'm just terrible at Googling, or maybe it's just popped up in the last couple of days, but I couldn't find anything on it, at least nowhere near to the degree of the Xbox Ones. Also, another argument is that a lot of the stuff for the audio is being offloaded to the GPU cycles on the Xbox, also on the PlayStation 4. We'll go into that later on really heavily because we're going to be further discussing the PS4's GPU, which is apparently going to be offloading some of this with audio raycasting and much more besides. There's another point of contention with the Kinect, as well as the overall voice commands and so on of the Xbox One. You need a better audio processor because it's going to be doing that much more work, right? So in other words, if you didn't have it, you'd be even worse off. Because imagine that you don't have the audio processor that's capable of doing all of this, and then you're offloading that to, the CPU. It's not really good because it actually has to understand the audio. So all of those different issues immediately pushing together. So there you have it. Right, now, the memory bandwidth equation. This is a huge one. And this is actually the point of most of the contention, but we're going to discuss a little bit of it on this video. I'm actually getting to the point where I need to start getting ready, and I'm probably going to have to no longer edit this video myself and send it to someone else to edit, because otherwise I'm going to be very unpopular at work. But I want to talk about this quite a bit, so I'm going to risk it. Anyway, we have more memory bandwidth, 176 gigabytes per second for the PS4, and on paper 272 for the Xbox One, because the ESRAM can do read and write cycles simultaneously. So I see this number misquoted, so let's get into that first. Firstly, there are several questions regarding the memory bandwidth of the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4. Not the PlayStation 4, but the Xbox One. It's really easy to figure out the memory bandwidth of the PS4, right? There are a couple of points of contention regarding a couple of the buses. We'll go into that in a moment. But generally, we know that there's 176 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth available to the GPU. The CPU has about 20 gigabytes per second of bandwidth, which should be enough, and so on. Now, the first point I would like to point out to both companies, and this is something that's really important, unless the memory bandwidth is needed, it's superfluous. In other words, it's unnecessary. Now, for the PlayStation 4, from what I understand from doing my research, 176 gigabytes per second is the sweet spot. In other words, it's the point where there's no longer any more required. Because, as it turns out, if you do a little bit of research on 384-bit buses for, say, the Radeon 7970, you'll notice that they've got a lot more memory bandwidth. It's got about 264 gigabytes per second, right? Okay, great. You understand. Not particularly difficult. So that means that, the Xbox, the PlayStation 4 needs more memory bandwidth? No. It simply means that look at the amount of compute units on the 7970 and look at the amount of compute units on the PS4. It simply means that there are more of them, right? There are 32 on the 7970, 18 on the PS4, more computing performance on the 7970 versus that of the PS4. In other words, it doesn't need 384-bit bus, it doesn't need the 264 whatever it is gigabytes per second memory bandwidth, because there's enough. Any more is superfluous, it's unnecessary, it's going to waste. The same thing goes, of course, to the CPU buses. In other words, anything more isn't necessary. You're basically just wasting silicon or cost on something that's never going to be used. So we have a fairly good understanding of the PlayStation 4. There are a couple of questions, and I'm going to have to go into a couple of these later because I'm going to run out of time. I'm basically extremely late already, unfortunately. But one of them is GDDR5 latency. Now, developers have spoken about that, and they have indeed agreed that there is a small amount of difference between the DDR3 and GDDR5. I believe they said it was writing better on the DDR3. I'll double check that later on, however. In regards, however, to the ESRAM, there are a couple of issues. Firstly, let's not talk about the bandwidth of adding them together, because that's a point of contention, right? But let's ignore that. The big one for me is the ESRAM itself. Because here's the thing. I could say to you that I get, let's just make up a figure, 40,000 views a day, right? Okay, this is just made up. But in reality, I've only ever got it once because, you know, I don't know, I uploaded like a really funny cat video or whatever, so one day I got 40,000 views, the rest of the day I got 1,000 views, right, which is completely made up numbers, but whatever. But it's not really true, is it? Now, this is the point a lot of people have been making with the ESRAM. They are saying that the issue with the ESRAM is that there's only 32 megabytes of it, and they're pointing out that it's not really being 100% honest with the specifications to say, well, that means you've got, you know, what was the figure now, 272 gigabytes per second peak. Because in reality, you're counting a buffer that's only 32 megabytes in size, and that to many people is not really accurate. Because some people are already arguing, well, how useful is this 32 megabyte buffer going to be? It depends on who you speak to. Some developers are stating that it's going to be really, really great. It's going to work and it's going to be enough memory. Other developers are saying that it's not going to be enough memory and that it's going to cause concerns. Other developers, similarly, are stating that well, the thing is, 32 megabytes is reasonable as a cache. They're saying that the hit rate, in other words, the chance that the data that they need is going to be held in the SRAM is relatively high. Therefore, it does do the job. They're saying that in theory, and theory of course doesn't equal practice, the 32 megabytes of RAM should be enough for 1080p at double buffering. But the questions, of course, are how well the developers themselves are going to utilize this ESRAM. And that's the problem that I personally have with all of this. It comes down to the developers. Now, I'm not saying developers are crap. I'm not saying developers are lazy. I'm not saying that developers aren't knowledgeable. I'm not saying that, I'm not saying that Microsoft developers are incompetent. I'm not saying that Microsoft's API is trash or anything like that. I'm just saying the problem with it is that you're basically forcing the developers to effectively use a system that is going to, at least to the perspective of, how we understand it, the developers have to code it themselves, right? So in other words, they have to make sure that the optimum pieces of code are held into that ESRAM, and that RAM is being utilized as necessary. If they're not, if it's being poorly utilized, if it's not being used how it should be, then effectively you're hampering your performance. That's how people are seeing it, and it's very difficult to argue with that point of view at the moment because, well, at the end of the day, developers are needing to really weigh in on it, and a lot of developers, any who have actually spoken at length, one of the things that they've praised about the PS4 consistently, if it's not the GPU capabilities, the main thing they've praised is the memory. Now, I'm not even talking about for the fact that it's, it's one big memory pool. It's unified. I'm saying that the fact that it's just easy to use, it's just simple. You could split the memory how you want, and it's right there. This would be very similar, even if they went with the notion of, and I'm not saying obviously this is better or anything, but even if they went with the traditional PC option of 4 gigs of or 8 gigs of DDR3 and 4 gigs of GDDR5. I'm not saying that's a better option, I'm just saying even if it wasn't, it's very easy to understand, and it's the same with the PlayStation 4, you can basically split the memory up however you want. With the Xbox One, that's not exactly the same. In other words, with the PS4, 176GB a second, it doesn't matter what you do with that memory. You could fill half of that memory up with, pictures of cats, and it's fine. It doesn't matter what percentage of the game you need for graphics. It doesn't matter what percentage of the game of the code you need for AI or whatever. All of it has exactly the same memory bandwidth available to it, and that's a really big concern because you've only got 32 megabytes of memory, which is really quick on the ESRAM. So even if you take out the equation of you can add all of this together, people are saying, well, it's not really accurate, is it? Because if you can only add 32 megabytes, that's a fraction. That's very small. Now, as I said, to be fair, developers are saying, some developers, the ones who have spoken about this, as well as tech analysis, are saying that, you know what, it's enough. They're saying that it is enough as long as you've got a good hit rate, it is enough to act as a good cache, and so on. The problem is, in my personal opinion, it means that there's not enough room for the code itself to grow. I'm not saying I'm right about this, because the fact of the matter is there's still a piece of information on both systems that hasn't been announced, and I'm hoping that I'm wrong, because it doesn't benefit me for me to be right, or anyone to be right about this, because I want both systems to be as good as possible so that they are as accurate and as cool as possible. So I'm hoping that there is some clarification on this later on, and I'm hoping that it's not too much of a big deal. So later on, I'm going to have to go now, guys, because I'm running really late. I shouldn't have been speaking this long, but yeah, I'm going to have to get going. So later on, I have several more things to really analyze on this. It's a huge topic, I know. And also, I want to start talking about the PlayStation 4's APIs, and that will be probably today/tomorrow, depending on how time goes. Anyway, I'm going to get going. As much as I don't want to, I'd love to just keep recording, but yeah, unfortunately, I need to make money for my job. So hopefully you've enjoyed the relatively, well, not even a brief video, it's like 33 bloody minutes, I didn't realise it was that long. Anyway, I'm going to get going. Take care, bye for now.